Hey guys, Endless here, welcome back to the channel. This is part 8 to What If Deku is Cursed Speech. Also check out the other videos on my playlists. But I hope you guys enjoy. Once Katsuki and Shoto had left the stage, Cementos walked over to said stage and glared at it. "Don't break this time," he growled. And after he said this, the pro hero moved his hands to the ground and reformed the stage. As this was happening, Yui had found Izuku in the waiting room and walked in. The green-haired boy looked up at her and then looked towards the screen. "Tuna, mustard leaf?" Yui smiled and nodded. "Yeah, my match is starting soon, I just wanted my good luck charm." Izuku raised an eyebrow and the black-haired girl ran over to him and gave him a hug. The green-haired boy was surprised for a moment but quickly hugged her back. They had stood like that for a moment, but that's when the duo heard Present Mix's voice over the intercoms. "Can the two next fighters come onto the stage?" The two broke the hug once they heard this, and Yui gave Izuku a small kiss. She then smiled and said, "I will see you in a bit." And with that, Yui walked towards the fighting arena. Izuku stared at her retreating form for a moment, then he turned his gaze onto the TV that was in the room. In Hosu City, Ingenium was doing his usual patrol, but that's when he heard a scream from what sounds like one of his sidekicks. He quickly activated his quirk and said Hero rushed into the alleyway, where he heard the shout. Once there, he looked around but found no one. He ran down the alley and noticed his sidekick on the ground bleeding. He bent down towards him and said, "I will get you an ambulance soon, don't worry." However, his sidekick looked scared. He then shouted, "He is still here, leave me." After he said this, the sidekick passed out due to blood loss. When Ingenium had heard this, he asked, "Who is still here? Is it the person who attacked you?" He sighed and was about to radio his other sidekicks in the area, however as he did, a voice could be heard behind him. "I think he means me." Ingenium turned around, and he barely had enough time to dodge the sword from cutting his head off. He put his sidekick down at the end of the alley, and glared at the man. "You are the hero killer, Stain." Once Stain had heard this, he laughed and he looked at Ingenium. "I guess you are one of the true heroes, but I need to make an example out of you." But as he said this, he licked the blade from his knife. "Wait, when did he hit me?" He then thought back from when he dodged, and grabbed my sidekick out of the way. His eyes went wide at the realization. During that split second when I turned my attention onto my sidekick, he used a smaller blade to cut me. After he thought this, he fell down towards the ground. And Stain was now hovering over him with his blade drawn. Now, this is for a more just world. Ingenium's last thought before everything turned into darkness was, "Sorry, brother." After he thought this, the hero killer plunged his sword into the hero's back. Back to the sports festival. Yui and Shiozaki were now standing in front of one another in the middle of the fighting stage. As the two stared at one another, Present Mike spoke up. "Now this is the third match of the quarter-finals." He then continued, "Yui Kodai versus Ibara Shiozaki." After he said this, Midnight spoke up to the two girls. "Are you both ready?" she asked. Both girls just nodded, and after Midnight saw this, she smiled and did a downward slash with her hand. Then Hajime. After the two girls heard this, they both jumped away from one another. They both knew how the other's quirk works. Yui reached for her pocket, but as she did, Shiozaki launched vines towards the black-haired girl. Said girl dodged to the side and pulled out a rock. She then launched it towards the vine-haired girl. Shiozaki turned around and did a prayer motion. And as she did, a big vine shield appeared behind her. Yui glanced down towards the ground and quickly used her quirk to make another rock into a boulder. As she did so, vines had appeared beneath said boulder. Yui got 10 rocks from her pockets and launched them towards Shiozaki. As she did this, the black-haired girl activated her quirk. Shiozaki opened her eyes once she heard multiple boulders coming towards her. She turned around and held her hands out towards the rocks. As Ibara did this, Yui had appeared at her side and smiled at her classmate. She then had her arm in a throwing motion. Shiozaki's eyes went wide for a moment, but after said moment it turned into a small smile. Yui had noticed this and sensed something below her. She tried to jump out of the way, but a vine snatched her leg and launched her towards the edge of the arena. The black-haired girl thought, as she blocked the boulders. Shiozaki also moved some vines underneath the ground to sneak up on me. Not bad. Yui smiled and threw a rock towards the edge of the arena. As she did so, said rock turned into a boulder. The black-haired girl flipped and crashed onto the rock, but winced a bit due to the impact. However, as this was happening, Shiozaki launched more vines towards the black-haired girl. Yui dodged to the side once she had noticed the attack. She was able to avoid most of the vines, but one had latched onto her arm. Then another latched onto her leg. Shiozaki was about to ask for her friend to surrender. However, she halted once Shiozaki noticed her opponent's smirk. Yui then activated her quirk, and the rocks she had thrown as she jumped to the side grew into boulders that cut the vines. As this was happening, the crowd was cheering at the fight, and Izuku was staring at the TV intently. He hoped that his girlfriend didn't get hurt, but that seems like that's too far-fetched. The green-haired boy knew that she wouldn't give up, that's how she always been. Back to the fight. Both girls huffed and was trying to catch their breath. Yui stood up and rubbed her wrists. That was a nice attack, she said with a smile. After Shiozaki heard this, she smiled as well and said, that was a nice counter. Yui bent down and picked up the rocks around her, and got into a stance, all the while putting said rocks in between her fingers. Well, shall we end this? Shiozaki put her hands in a prayer motion again. After Yui saw this, she dashed towards Shiozaki, but as she did, the black-haired girl was keeping her attention onto the ground as well. She didn't want to be caught off guard again. As Yui approached the center of the arena stage where Ibara was standing at, said girl moved her hair onto the ground at a fast rate. But some of her hair rushed towards Yui above said ground. Once the black-haired girl saw this, she threw a rock in front of her and jumped to her left. After she did this, however, the rock that was in front of her grew into a boulder, but as it did, the vines latched onto it and Shiozaki launched it towards Yui. The black-haired girl didn't expect this move and didn't know what to do. She wouldn't be able to dodge in time. However, as the boulder got closer, the ground beneath Yui broke and massive vines appeared in front of Yui and shielded her from the attack. Once the rock crashed into the vine shield, there was a loud bang. After the impact, Shiozaki moved the rock with her quirk and asked for Midnight to call the match. Once the pro heroine noticed how the vines trapped Yui, she nodded. Winner Ibara Shiozaki. As she announced this, Shiozaki unwrapped her vines and the black-haired girl huffed and muttered, I didn't expect her to launch it towards me. But she walked over to Shiozaki and smiled at the other girl. Said girl smiled and said that was a good fight. Yui just nodded and the two girls made their way back to the stands. As they were leaving, the crowd were cheering and President Mike was surprised at how that fight had went. He then coughed into his fist and spoke. Alright, next match will begin after Cementos fixes the arena. Said Hiro grumbled about stupid loud co-workers. He then put his hands onto the ground and added more cement towards said arena. He then spoke in a cold tone towards the fighting stage, if you break one more time I am going to make sure you are 10 feet up into the air and it will cover the whole area. After he said this, he huffed and walked over to his seat with his arms over his chest. President Mike looked over towards Aizawa and asked, maybe we should ask Nizu to give him a raise or something. This is like the 10th time he had to fix the arena. Aizawa just chuckled, and as he did so his scarf moved to the side a bit, then Nizu popped out of said scarf. The Chimera asked for the mic and Hizashi handed it over to him. Once Nizu grabbed it, he spoke, Hi everyone, I hope you all are enjoying the sports festival so far. After he spoke, the crowd recognized his voice as the principal of UA. They all cheered in agreement. He then spoke again, why don't you all give a round of applause for all of our staff and pro heroes we have in this event. As he was talking to the crowd, Kirishima and Tsuyu were waiting for their names to be called. After a moment, Nizu gave the mic back to the DJ Hiro, said Hiro took it and coughed a bit. He then spoke, alright, last match of the quarter-finals. Ejiro Kirishima vs Tsuyu Ajui. As he said this, said duo walked onto the fighting arena and noticed that it was slightly taller than what they remembered. However, they both shrugged and they were now standing in front of one another. Kirishima was stretching while Azui was watching on. After a moment of silence, Midnight's voice could be heard throughout the stadium. "Are both fighters ready?" Both students nodded in affirmative. "Then let the last match of the quarter-finals begin." As she said this, Kirishima punched his hands together and activated his quirk, "Let's give it our best." He then dashed towards the frog girl, who dodged to the side, and launched her tongue towards Kirishima. Said redhead grabbed it and almost let go of it, however he made sure his quirk wasn't activated on his hands so he doesn't cut the frog girl by accident. He then turned around and roared. As he did this, Tsuyu got sent flying out of bounds. She landed onto the grass and looked up at Kirishima, who was giving her a thumbs up. Tsuyu just smiled, and as they did this, Midnight spoke up. "Winner, Ajiro Kirishima." Present Mike then spoke up after the heroine, "In 10 minutes the semi-finals will begin." After Izuku heard this, he started to stretch, and just as he did, the door to his waiting room opened. He raised an eyebrow and wondered who would come visit him. Yui is in the infirmary right now due to the impact. When she landed onto that boulder, he had tried to visit her, but Recovery Girl didn't let him. When the person walked into the room, Izuku raised another eyebrow at the new entry. Shoto looked towards Midoriya and asked if they could talk for a moment. Izuku just nodded dumbly. This is probably the most Todoroki talked to him, though after a minute of thinking, Izuku shouldn't be talking. Not that he could unless he wants to activate his quirk. But as he was in his thoughts, Shoto coughed, which brought the green-haired boy back towards the world of the living. He stared at him and asked, "Salmon?" Todoroki just nodded and continued to speak. However, just as he was about to, Izuku waved his hands in front of him frantically. He then pulled out his phone and typed in it. Shoto just waited as he did this, and Izuku tapped. "Speaker. How do you understand me? I never really talked to you." After Todoroki heard this, he chuckled. "I can just tell by your facial expression and the tone you use. It just implies your answer, and I took a guess. It isn't that hard," he shrugged. Izuku just stared at him in shock. Todoroki just sweat dropped and asked, "What?" The green-haired boy started to bang his head on the table in the room, all the while muttering, "Caviar, caviar, caviar." After a moment, Izuku pulled out his phone again and typed into it. "You gave me an idea on how to make something that can translate my voice to match normal words." Todoroki just nodded and said, "Well, you are welcome. Either way, I wanted to ask, I know you're close with Bakugo, and I want to know what kind of hero do you want to be?" I asked Bakugo about this, but he just said, in his words, "Why don't you ask Izuku? He is the one that could probably give you a better answer than me. I just want to make sure no one gets hurt when I'm around, and that I always win." Izuku thought about it for a moment and started to type on his phone for a minute. As he was doing this, Todoroki sat down and waited for his response. Shoto wanted to know if the way he was going about using his quirk was wrong or right. After a few more seconds, Izuku pressed speaker. "Well, for me, a hero is those who protect others, even when no one asked you to, and to always bring hope to people when they see me." The phone then continued. "I also saw your fights and noticed how you and your father don't have a good relationship with one another, but all I'm going to say about that is..." Todoroki held his breath and waited for Izuku to continue. Said boy started typing again and clicked. "Speaker. Isn't your quirk called half cold half hot? I'm pretty sure Endeavor's quirk is called Hellfire. So I don't think you realize this, but your fire quirk is your own, not his." After he put his phone away, there was an awkward silence for a moment. Then, without warning, Shoto started to bang his head on the table, all the while muttering, "Stupid, stupid, stupid." He then stopped and gave a grateful smile to Izuku, who looked at him with an amused look. "I have came to my decision, thank you, Midoriya," and with that he walked outside towards the UA stands. Said green-haired boy just gave a thumbs up and said, "Salmon." As Todoroki left, present mixed voice could be heard. "Can the next fighters for the semi-finals come onto the stage?" After Izuku heard this, he stood up and walked towards the fighting stage. 2 minutes later, Present Mike spoke after a moment. Alright, the first fight of the semi-finals begins now. As he said this, the two boys walked onto the arena. Ejiro Kirishima versus Izuku Midoriya. After he said this, Midnight stood up and asked the two boys if they were ready. At their nod, Midnight shouted, "Hajime." Both boys stared at one another, and Izuku wondered how he could end this fight without resorting to his more destructive moves. He doesn't want to use his quirk that much until his fight with the blonde. He then got into a stance and Kirishima grinned and did the same. "Well, I have to get through this unbreakable wall first," Izuku thought. He then muttered, "Accelerate," when he noticed Kirishima rushing at him. However, the redhead was surprised when Izuku appeared behind him and launched a kick towards him. Kirishima activated his quirk and Izuku stopped his kick halfway and aimed a punch towards his side, which connected and sent the boy flying. Ejiro flipped mid-air and punched his hand onto the ground. He left a trail as he did, then Kirishima stood up and rubbed his side. So he knows I can't activate my quirk throughout my whole body, and he used that to his advantage. He glanced at Izuku, who was staring at him with a calculating gaze. Kirishima just huffed and activated his quirk again. The redhead then dashed towards Izuku and said green-haired boy dodged his punches and kicks. After a minute of dodging, Ejiro shouted, "Just stay still." Izuku just nodded and shouted, "Don't move." Ejiro stopped dead in his tracks and sweat dropped. "You know I didn't mean me." Instead of responding, Izuku launched a punch toward Kirishima's face. However, he activated his hardening and Izuku heard a crack and quickly moved his hand back. Kirishima felt his cracked face and wondered, how strong was that punch for him to be able to crack my quirk like that? Izuku stared at his bloody knuckles and thought, this won't work. If I decide to explode him, if I miscalculate, I would just send him outside of the arena. And if I put too little power, nothing will happen. But during this time that the green-haired boy was thinking, Kirishima rushed him and punched Izuku on his face. Said boy got sent back and he quickly caught himself. He spat to the side and blood came out and Izuku glared at Kirishima. After the redhead noticed his glare, he just muttered, "Sorry?" Izuku growled and thought back to how he enhances Katsuki's explosions. His eyes went wide and he roared, "Accelerate, plus wind pressure." After Kirishima heard this, he activated his quirk on his whole body and put his arms up and across. As he did so, Izuku launched off towards the redhead. And when the green-haired boy appeared in front of Kirishima, there was a loud boom. Izuku had launched his fist and the results were similar to that of All Might's Detroit Smash. The green-haired boy stared at his arm in wonder, like he was staring at it for the first time. Around his fist there were small wind currents that looked like it was moving around said fist. He also noticed as he threw his punch, the wind accelerated along with his punch, which resulted in the boom. Izuku looked at the wind that was still circulating around his fist. He didn't even care that his arm looked purple. However, he turned his gaze towards the other side of the arena. Cementos had to use his quirk to make a makeshift net to catch Kirishima out of cement. The green-haired boy had launched him towards the air and he would have flown out of the arena if the pro hero didn't do that. After a moment of silence, the crowd had erupted into cheers. Izuku made his way towards the waiting room, still looking at the small wind currents on his hand. Midnight then spoke up. Winner Izuku Midoriya. After the robots took Kirishima to the infirmary, President Mike was about to speak, but Cementos shouted, "I know." He then looked towards the arena and fought back to the last attack. That punch reminded me of one of All Might's attacks. The pro hero then glanced at the redhead on the stretcher and he was able to block that punch, but both of his arms broke on impact. Still, to be able to block a punch with that much power is nothing short of amazing. Half of the fighting stage was now destroyed, completely down the middle from where Izuku attacked. However, he growled and remembered he has to fix this up. "Alright, I warned you, dumb arena." Cementos then covered the whole arena with the fighting stage. The only place that still had grass was at the edge of each tunnel. He grinned and then glared at President Mike, daring him to tell him to turn it back to normal. Said hero gulped and looked over towards Nizu. Said Chimera thing just shrugged, "It will be better having a big fighting area." President Mike just nodded and spoke, "All right, second match for the semifinals. Ibara Shiozaki vs Katsuki Bakugo. After he said this, both of them walked onto the stage and stood in front of one another. Katsuki smirked and Ibara wondered if she could give up now, however she glanced at her class and saw that they were all cheering her on. With newfound confidence she smiled nervously, hoping that she is able to win. As this was happening, Yui had dragged Izuku out of the waiting room and took him to Recovery Girl to treat his arm. Said heroine had smacked Izuku with her cane for not coming straight to her. Back to the fight. Midnight then shouted. Are both fighters ready? Both of them nodded and Midnight spoke up once again. Alright, then let the last match of the semi-finals begin. After the two heard this, Shiozaki was about to send her quirk towards the ground, however she halted her attack. Once she noticed Bakugo at her side, said blonde grabbed onto her shirt and spun once and shouted DIEE. And with that he launched Shiozaki towards Class 1B stands, all the while said girl had tears falling from her face and she landed with a loud boom. Luckily enough, Kendo and some of her classmates were able to stop her fall and make sure she didn't get hurt. However, they still shouted towards the blonde and said that could have been dangerous. Katsuki shrugged and said, would you rather her be implanted onto the arena wall, he asked while pointing to the huge fighting arena around him. Everyone just sweat drop and Class 1B stood quiet at that. He was right, it probably would have knocked the girl out if he did that, so Katsuki probably knew that her class would catch the vine-haired girl. But still, to do that without a second thought, Mineta muttered. He was about to say something else, but Tsuyu had smacked him with her tongue. Present Mike then shouted the final round will begin in 10 minutes, however the blonde shouted towards him, which caught the hero's attention. Why do we have to wait that long, can't we fight now? He then continued. The arena isn't even damaged at all. Present Mike stared at Nizu, who shrugged again. The DJ hero sweat drop, isn't this your event? He coughed and said if Izuku Midoriya is okay with it dash. However he stopped once he noticed the green-haired boy walking towards the arena. Bakugo just grinned at him and started to stretch. He then spoke, finally we will see who is the stronger between the two of us, at least as of now. Izuku just nodded, understandably knowing about what he meant. One for all. The green-haired boy then started to stretch as well. As the duo were doing this, Present Mike spoke up, alright, the final match of the sports festival will now begin. Izuku Midoriya vs Katsuki Bakugo. After he said this, Midnight was about to ask if they were ready, but that's when both boys dashed towards one another. Both launched a punch at each other and the two attacks had clashed in the middle of the arena, which shook the ground slightly. Midnight just muttered under her breath and sat down. Izuku launched a high kick towards the blonde and Katsuki responded in kind with a kick of his own. Both of their attacks cancelled each other out and they both jumped away from one another. The two stared at each other for a minute and Izuku got into a fighting stance. Katsuki did the same and the two idly watched a feather fall down towards the ground. Once the feather touched said ground, the two boys launched off towards one another again. The blonde launched a straight punch and Izuku launched a punch of his own, then the two boys were locked in a high-speed fist fight that looked like a dance to the onlookers. Everyone just stood quiet and watched, even Present Mike and Shota were watching in silence. Nizu watched on and wondered, I now see why All Might decided to take an interest in these two boys. They're strong. As he thought this, there were cracks appearing from all over the arena stage and Katsuki had launched a kick towards Izuku's stomach in which it connected. But as it landed, Izuku launched a high kick to the side of the blonde's face. Both boys flew back and landed onto the ground with a thud. After a second, Izuku stood up and Katsuki did the same. Katsuki put his hands behind him and the green-haired boy moved his scarf down. Katsuki then roared. Blasting speed turbo, cluster. Izuku shouted in response. Body enhancement, plus accelerate. Both boys then launched themselves at one another once again and Katsuki spun mid-air and launched an explosion-powered kick towards Izuku's face. Said boy shouted. Redirect. And the kick was slightly off, barely hitting off some of his hair. He then launched a punch towards Katsuki. Once the blonde saw this, he launched an explosion from the bottom of his foot and flew up into the air. Izuku jumped back and shouted, "Blast away!" Katsuki got launched higher into the air and spat out some blood. Izuku started to cough up some blood a bit too. But both boys were smiling and the pro heroes noticed this. Yui just watched on in worry. She knew that if the two fought to their heart's content they're going to break each other. The black-haired girl didn't want Izuku to overuse his quirk so soon, he had surgery not even 2 weeks ago. But as she thought about it more, so did the blonde. Anyways, back to the fight. Katsuki caught himself mid-air with an explosion and launched an explosion behind him. In doing so he was now speeding towards Izuku. All the while spinning with explosion, but he made sure to condense them. Izuku saw this and readied his punch. He then shouted, "Accelerate, plus wind pressure." Katsuki roared and launched his attack towards the ground, and as he did this Izuku threw his fist forward. The blonde shouted, "Clustered Howitzer Cyclone." Both attacks clashed and fought for dominance, but then there was a loud boom. The whole fighting arena was engulfed in a fire cyclone that went up into the air. Yui wanted to jump down to stop the fight, but Kendo had stopped her. Once the smoke cleared, Izuku and Katsuki forms can be seen at the edge of the arena across from one another. The fighting arena was now just a massive crater. Midnight was about to call the match, but that's when she noticed both of the boys twitch. And after a second they both stood up. Izuku had burn marks on the side of his face and his scarf plus his shirt was now non-existent. Katsuki had his left eye closed shut and there was blood coming off the side of his face, also his shirt got destroyed from the explosion as well. Both boys huffed and Izuku coughed up some blood. Katsuki wondered if they should keep going, but the look on his friend's face said it all. He wanted to keep fighting. Izuku stopped coughing and that's when something hit him on top of the head. It sent the boy towards the ground in a thud. All the while you can hear a not-so-innocent voice saying oops. Izuku glared up at whoever threw the bottle at him and saw that it was Yui. He raised an eyebrow and looked down towards the culprit of the attack. And saw that it was his cough syrup. He chuckled and picked up his precious. It must have flown out during the big attack. He idly wondered how the black-haired girl caught it. He then opened it and drank it all in one gulp. As this was happening, Katsuki was waiting for Izuku to finish. He too didn't want the fight to end this way. After the green-haired boy was done, he let out a satisfied huff and gave a grateful thumbs up to his girlfriend. Though he could tell by the look on her face that she is angry with him. Izuku then looked over towards Katsuki and threw his cough syrup to the side. Katsuki got into a stance of his own and was about to launch an explosion towards Izuku. However, the green-haired boy looked up into the sky and roared, "Snow blizzard." This made Katsuki stop his approach and he raised an eyebrow towards Izuku, who was just breathing hard, but he had a grin. After a second out of thin air, snow started to fall down towards the arena and Katsuki just looked at Izuku in realization. "You're going to make it harder for me to use my explosions in the cold," the blonde thought. 30 seconds passed and there was now a cold breeze flowing throughout the UA Sports Festival. People in the stands stared at the green-haired boy in shock. He changed the weather, they all thought. All Might stared at the fight in anticipation. He didn't know who would win. Katsuki can last longer in a fight of endurance, but he knows that the blonde bomber doesn't want to win that way. And as he thought this, Izuku looked around in surprise. He honestly didn't think that would work, but the green-haired boy knew he won't be able to hold it for that long. He then dashed towards the blonde, who for his part, once he noticed his attack, moved to the side and launched an explosive swipe towards the green-haired boy. Though it was weaker than the one he used against Tenya. Side note, also during this time Tenya had already left towards the hospital for his brother, just thought I had to put that in there. Anyways, Izuku was able to redirect the explosion at the last second. But as he did, Katsuki launched another attack towards the green-haired boy. AP shot, autocannon. Izuku's eyes went wide and shouted, "Body enhancement." He then put his arm on across, the attack then made contact with flesh and boom! Izuku got sent into the ground with a few burn marks on his arm. Katsuki had lowered the power of that move. He didn't want to fatally injure his friend after all. The green-haired boy looked at Bakugo and muttered, "Explode." Boom! Katsuki had flew back and he too landed on the ground with a thud. After a moment of silence, the blonde shouted angrily, "What did I say about using explosions against me?" As he said this, he stood up with his hands to his side and small explosions were lighting up. Izuku roared back, "Tuna, tuna, mustard leaf." After Katsuki heard this, he shouted back, "Oh, I made sure to lower it so it didn't pierce your skin." Once Izuku heard this, he shouted, "Caviar, fish flakes." Bakugo gasped when he heard this, "You take that back." As this was happening, everyone else was just confused. The only one who followed the conversation was Yui. She was laughing slightly to what Izuku had said. Kendo looked over towards her friend and asked, "What did he say?" "Oh, nothing, he just called him an overgrown Pomeranian with anger issues." Kendo just sweat dropped. How did she know what he meant? After a minute, blood was coming out from Izuku's eye. He noticed this and wiped the blood away. Katsuki just huffed and thought, "Looks like this will be the last attack." He looked down towards his hands and saw that his arms were now purple. Bakugo sighed and put both arms in front of him. "All right, this will hurt," he muttered. Izuku saw this and walked forward a bit. The blonde-haired boy then shouted, "This is my strongest attack." As he said this, his hands lit up and he roared, "Ground Zero." After Izuku heard this, he shouted, "Burn away, plus expand." Boom! Due to the cold weather, once the two heated set air up, it caused an explosion that almost destroyed the whole stadium. Before the boys had launched their attacks, Midnight and Cementos had tried to stop them, but to no avail. Cementos used the ground to reinforce the stadium. All Might even had to launch a punch into the air to try and redirect the blast upward. Todoroki had used his ice in an effort to try and help. Once the smoke died down, there was a minute of silence. Everyone was wondering who had won. The smoke cleared on one side and everyone saw that Izuku was indented into a wall. Then on the other side of the arena, Katsuki was indented into a wall as well. Midnight was about to call the match a draw, but both boys got out of the wall with some effort. Said heroine looked over to Nizu, who nodded his head. She then shouted, "The final match of the sports festival is a..." However, her next word left her mouth as she saw Katsuki fall down towards the ground. Izuku Midoriya. After the green-haired boy heard this, he smiled weakly, but soon after coughed up blood and fell onto the ground. The green-haired boy was now in a pool of his own blood. But that is the end of this part. If you enjoyed this part, leave a like and let me know what you guys thought of how I did the fight in the comments. I hope you guys liked it.